Mr. JP Marceau, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss this very important book, Post-reductionist Christianity, Solution to the Meaning Crisis. This is, as I was saying before, this is the book I'd been waiting for somebody to write for quite some time. So I'm really chuffed that you did write it, and I highly recommend people check it out. And that's what we're going to explore today. So yeah, thanks for being here and thanks for writing the book.
Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so maybe to start off with, how would you define reductive materialism? What is it for people that are maybe uncertain?
Yeah, maybe a good place to start is when it historically started. I mean, you can find predecessors in ancient Greece, but by and large, reductive materialism arose at the time of the early modernity with thinkers like Galileo, who were starting to mathematize the external world and who had some success. So Galileo was able to predict how certain things moved physically, like balls rolling down inclined planes and these kinds of things. And this was kind of a surprise for people, because if you can describe with math what happens in the external world, you don't see the qualities, the forces in mathematics themselves. You just see abstract equations. You don't see color and taste and emotions. There's a lot that seems to be missing in mathematical equations. But if you can describe the external world in math, then what's the interplay between those abstract mathematics and qualities? And obviously Galileo was not at the point where physics could pretend to explain everything, but he could sort of see that this would be a philosophical problem. If we start to mathematize the world, what do we do with things that don't seem to be mathematizable? And what Galileo hypothesized was that the external world is just mathematical, no qualities. So no feelings there, no emotions, no internal drive or anything. It's just abstract equations that you are sufficient to describe what happens in the external world. And then minds have qualities and can sort of put qualities onto things in the external world. So this was Galileo's working hypothesis, and this is where materialism comes from. You can say that for Galileo, the idea was the external world is reducible to mathematics. Another way to say it is that it's reducible to its material components, and you describe them using mathematics. So ultimately, everything in the external world would be just atoms. People didn't know at the time what might be the smallest components of matter. We still don't totally have a clear idea what's going on there, but in principle, the idea was, if you know the physical world in its smallest material constituents, then you can reduce everything down to those constituents. You describe them with math, and you explain everything in the external world. So, as I said initially, this was scoped to just the external world. It didn't include the human mind. And what happened down the line, as successes accumulated in material science, in engineering, people started to put more and more things from their ontology into reductive materialism. So people at some point wanted to put the human mind, wanted to put God, or evacuate God altogether. So that's how the wave has gotten to us today, where someone who's a reductive materialist is someone who wants to reduce everything that exists down to smallest material components, and ultimately that would explain everything. So another way to put it is that if you look at, let's say, a human person with a human mind, really the mind is just neuroscience, let's say, and neuroscience really is just then it's really just chemistry, and chemistry really is just physics. So ultimately everything is just physics, including the human mind. This is what reductive materialists claim.
Totally. Biology reduces to chemistry, chemistry reduces to physics and everything. Yeah, and Galileo, interestingly, I'd heard it described almost as a thought experiment, that he was can we just subtract the human totally from the world and just describe it entirely as just objects? But that he was doing it in a way as an experiment almost. You call the reductionist materialist lab leak, I think it is, that it was initially a scientific experiment, a methodology to try and learn things. It was never meant to be an entire account of reality and explain human beings and everything like that. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I think Galileo would have been very surprised to see that a few centuries later, people would try to reduce the human mind to matter. That wasn't the initial hypothesis.
Yes, yeah, and his daughter was a nun as well. I found out. I have There's a great book on it, Galileo's daughter. It's supposed to be very good. But yeah, Galileo. Maybe it wasn't entirely his fault. He got yeah
Yeah,
get a bad rap. But okay, so that's a great account, I think, of reductionist materialism. And what are the maybe we could just talk about the flaws of that. Like, where it seems kind of obvious on the face of it that humans don't really exist in some sense if you do that. But like, yeah, what are your favorite arguments against reductive materialism? Like, where you see like the holes in it?
yeah. So we have quite a lot to choose from. This wasn't the case, I'd say, 30 years ago. The errors weren't as obvious, but they've really accumulated in the literature now. And there are many arguments that I wouldn't have time to list. Some of them come from science, and some of them come from philosophy. And when I talk about science, it comes from different sciences, really. So the way that I like to classify them is that you have some objections that come from the top, and you have some objections that come from below. So if you're a reductive materialist, the idea is you can reduce everything, including the human mind, down to matter. So you can sort of attack this by two ways. One is you can try to see things at the level of the human mind or above, or really just think anything that's like above the lowest layers, and try to give an argument according to which you cannot really reduce this to lower levels. Or another approach would be to attack the lower layer, what the materialists claim everything is reducible to, and you show that, well, like, you don't even know really what that thing is, so don't pretend like you're reducing everything down to it. So those two kinds of arguments can work. The one I like coming from the top is
Yeah,
the
maybe we
fact.
start with the top ones, and then we'll
Yeah,
have a look at the bottom after. Will be good.
yeah. So one that I like from the top is like the consensus, I would say, in cognitive science that's coming up. I don't know what's the latest state of things. I should ask John Trevicki like how he has seen things moving. Like early on in his career, materialism was much more common in cognitive science. People trying to reduce the human mind to, let's say, programs in computers, or like certain neuronal networks and so on. But the last time I spoke to John about it, he says that like it's maybe 50-50. Like lots of people don't think that can work anymore, and the people who try to study the human mind, or really like any higher system, so couldn't, maybe not even just the human mind, but could be like a complex program in a computer, or interactions between animals in a certain ecosystem. People who try to understand these higher level systems at the level of the higher system are able to explain more things than the people who just try to reduce them to lower level entities. So for instance, in the case of you can even just, a good example I think is the cell. If you try to study the biology of a cell, and you try to just reduce what happens in the cell by looking at its organelles. I always mess up the name in English. I think it's organelles in English. But
Sounds good.
if you try to do this, you won't be able to make a lot of progress. You can explain the possibilities, like you can explain things that might happen in the cell, looking at its lower level entities, but you just basically have possibilities. To be able to say what possibilities will get selected, you need to take the cell as a whole, where you add a system of interconnected organelles that will act as constraint on the possibilities of the lower level organelles. So this means that, okay, you do have possibilities that come from below that you can predict. You can predict possibilities looking at below. But if you want to know what will happen, you need to look at what happens at the higher layer that's going to constrain those possibilities. And
Yeah.
another example, because we can see the same thing at like other layers in the hierarchy, one that's very close to us is when we make a decision. Like when I need to make a decision, what I will see is that suggestions will pop up. Like I will have possibilities that come to mind. I might do this thing, I might do that thing, I might do that other thing. But me as a whole, I will make a selection upon those possibilities, and I will pick one. That's what I'll do. So you have this emergence of possibilities from below. You could say like from, and I'm totally open to the idea that you could study like different neuronal networks that like suggest this thing or that thing. There
Mhm.
have been studies on that kind of thing, but like that we select one thing or not, that like there's no reductive explanation for it. We like the human mind, the human person as a whole, even connected with the environment, has a constraining effect on the possibilities that emerge in those smaller systems. So that's a kind of argument I really like against reductionism, because it comes from science, from cognitive science, where it's becoming more and more mainstream to accept that, okay, like we will just be able to explain more things if we don't try to reduce everything down to lower layers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think that type of project, yeah, of using higher levels to explain lower levels. One argument I always liked against materialism was like, if you're trying to explain a TV show, like trying to explain a TV show by reducing it to the wires and the signals, the electric signals and these things. It's like, okay, you can explain, the wires and the signals, but you're not going to explain the actual content of the experience, which is like kind of similar to the hard problem, I suppose, which you talk about in the book. Because I really like those other two top-down arguments. The hard problem, can't reduce phenomenal experience to neuronal activity. And then the rationality argument, which is that if you reduce the rational to the non-rational, then you lose rationality. Like if rationality is just random neuronal activity, then there is no rationality, and you can't have a rational theory of rationality that's just, neuronal activity. I wonder,
Yeah.
is there anything on those as well? Because I think they're, such
Yeah.
sticky problems
Yeah. And if
for
you like
reductive
them, we can
materialism.
talk about them. They're also, it's funny because the art problem of consciousness is fairly recent. Like you
Yeah.
can't really find people being interested in that kind of stuff until materialism becomes established in academia. So like you don't see anything like that during the Middle Ages. Like people wondering about why we have phenomenal experiences. Because if you don't, if you don't have the problem of materialism, you're just not surprised that there are qualities in the world and that they can be combined into complex forms or like simpler forms. So anyway, materialism comes to a peak in like maybe the middle of the 20th century, where there are like research programs where in psychology and neuroscience people are trying to reduce everything down to physics ultimately. But this starts to break down because on the one side it doesn't make a lot of progress, and because it doesn't make a lot of progress, then like at some point the philosophical arguments come in and they gain more and more traction in the sciences themselves. So maybe the person most responsible for this is David Chalmers in the 90s, who coined the term hard problem of consciousness. And the idea there is, okay, when people are trying to explain aspects of consciousness by reducing them to smaller behavioral aspects of consciousness, they do make some progress. So, for instance, people are able to explain maybe why we move certain ways, why computers can learn certain things in certain ways. Like people can explain behaviors. Well, a lot of this is not done, like, and it might never happen because it's so complex. But in principle, you can explain, let's say, being awake, moving, like some of the things we attribute to consciousness, the fact that we're awake and not sleeping, the fact that we react to certain stimuli but not others. There are certain aspects of consciousness that, okay, maybe we can reduce them to the behaviors of simpler systems. But what seems completely intractable from that strategy is explaining why we have qualia, why we have phenomenal experiences, why it feels like something to like stub your toe against something, to see a certain color, all those things. And there's a few thought experiments that became popular to illustrate the problem. By the way, you don't have to like fully agree with like what people suggest in those kinds of thought experiments. The goal is just to see that you're reaching a contradiction there. Like you will need to rethink what you're doing. So a famous one is the inverted collar thought experiment. From it's originally from Shoemaker, but Chalmers uses it along with a few others. But I quite like it because it makes the problem fairly clear. Imagine a vision scientist named Mary who spends all of her life in a black and white room. So she never gets to actually see the color red, for instance. But she's a vision scientist and she spends all of her life learning all there's to know about the physics, the biology, the neuroscience of vision. So she can explain really well that if she goes outside of her black and white room and she sees a red apple, certain photons will hit her eyes. They will have this wavelength. They will trigger this and this process in her brain, and it's gonna make her say, "This is red." I'm surprised. Like maybe in theory, she could even explain like she could even predict like how she will react to seeing this and so on. But still, she will learn something that she didn't know before when she experiences the color red. Like even if she knew materially everything that would happen, psychologically everything that would happen, she doesn't really know the color red until she has the experience of the color red. And The point there is that, okay, there is such a thing as phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of experiences, of qualities,
Mm.
that escapes what a materialist reductionist can say about it. Because if all of knowledge could be reduced to material physical knowledge, then Mary would have had this even before she left her black and white room, but she doesn't. So that shows that there's a flaw in the materialist thinking. You need to like broaden your theory of the world to encompass things that don't currently fit in there. So that's one kind of argument. There are other thought experiments that do the same kind of thing. And then the other argument you mentioned is the irreducibility of rationality. This is funny because this one is not recent at all. As I said, the
It
odd problem.
goes back to Plato, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
at least Plato. Like people
Mm.
might have made it before, but at least to
Mm.
Plato. So like 2,500 years. Whereas the art problem is very recent. The problem of the reducibility of consciousness is very well known. You can see in Plato's dialogues very often what happens is someone tries to reduce something, not just rationality, could also be goodness or love, but people try to reduce something fairly high in the hierarchy to something very low. And what Plato does is always just tangle people up into their own words when they do this and show that they are always somewhere presupposing what they're trying to reduce. So for rationality, this is true. The most common way people try to reduce rationality these days is try to reduce it to neuroscience, and down the line neuroscience would reduce to physics. But if you do this, you're gonna have you're gonna have a big problem. Okay, so why like why would neuroscience yield rational agents? Like, why would evolutionary biology, let's say, yield agents that can actually reach truth rather than just survival? Like, where's the alignment coming from? Another way to put it, too, which is the way that I refer to in the book, is comes from John Vervaeke and his colleague, I think Dan Chiappi. The way they put it is that it's in terms of relevance realization. If you think you can give a theory that reduces rationality to something, you have a problem because in the idea of theory, you need someone rational to apply the theory. You can take a much simpler theory. Like before we get to a theory that would reduce rationality, just take Newton's laws and you try to explain the interactions between physical bodies using Newton's laws. Let's say a ball rolling down an inclined plane. You try to just explain this with Newton's laws. A rational human can do this pretty easily. Like there's a differential equation, you know the slope, and so on. You'll be able to predict things. But you are actually doing a lot of things as a rational agent in there. You are ignoring, let's say, friction, ignoring the wind. You're presupposing that no one will come and block the ball when it's rolling down. There's a whole bunch of things that you're ignoring, or rather that you're cutting off. A way to put it is that we're doing relevance realization. We're only focusing on what's relevant for the application of the theory. But this is not something that you can reduce easily. This is something that a rational agent is really doing. So it means that if you try to reduce rationality to a theory, if you try to have a theory of rationality, you're not really going to do it. You're going to need a rational agent to apply that theory, to make that theory intelligible. So it goes back to Plato, and people have made various formulations of this argument, but you need to consider rationality as something non-reducible, or otherwise your arguments to reduce rationality don't come from a rational place, so we don't need to listen to them.
It's self-contradictory. Yeah, that just seems to be everywhere in this, man. If you reduce human beings to like just this like cellular neuronal activity, or like consciousness is epiphenomenal, it's like, well, scientists have consciousness and that's the basis of their theorizing, of their intelligibility. It's like you actually hit a point where you undermine your own theorizing, but then at the same time just affirm that it's true. It's such a weird. Robert Sapolsky does this all the time, man, with his like Behave book, which is just assumes reductive materialism, never argues for it, and then is just like, yeah, consciousness is epiphenomenal, free will doesn't exist. And it's like, but if that's the case, I mean, your argument, making an argument is an action. Like it's something that you do, and you have to be connected to reality. You have to have rationality. You have to have intelligibility for it to be true or false. So your argument actually undermines itself. It undermines the existence of arguments. And I don't know how that's like that kind of self-contradictory thing has been allowed to go on for so long with like so-called sensible people. You're just like, clearly that undermines the whole project. Like, but I don't know, for some reason it's been very popular
Yeah, I think it's
for
just lack
years.
of philosophical training. Because I mean,
Yeah.
if you do most of your like studying in the sciences,
Mhm.
where you like implicitly tend to work with a kind of reductionism, at least people did for a long time. I think that's less and less
Mm.
true, but for a long time, people assumed a kind of reductionism. So when people started to venture into philosophical areas, they would carry forward a kind of reductionism without knowing it, and it would lead to those kinds of errors that you're describing. But if those people do more philosophy, I don't think that's going to stand.
It's not going to happen. And has there been in AI, I know you mentioned in the book of like how they train AI models and stuff, has revealed a sense where reductionist materialism doesn't really fly either.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you talk about emergence,
Hmm.
you're denying materialism. The
Hmm.
idea in materialism is that really, like, to understand something, you you just reduce it to its parts, and there's nothing interesting that happens at the higher layers. Really, it's just
Hmm.
always a kind of illusion on the lower layer. But if you're an AI researcher right now, you're building a product that feeds on tons of data and learns in a kind of virtual world where, okay, you give it some input, and the system has an artificial brain, like an artificial neural network or some other kind of architecture, but that simulates a brain that's going to transform this output in a certain response. And based on the response, you will like reinforce or decrease the current settings, and then you keep exploring this way for lots and lots of iterations. We can build systems that become pretty good, but the way that they do it is by interacting actively in an environment with input and output. So it's a kind of little world that we're putting those machines in.
Hmm.
And what happens is that there are qualities that will emerge in those systems. So we don't understand why, but at some point, like maybe they start understanding how to speak French. At some point, they figure out geometry. At some point, like so there are like higher level patterns that those things start to pick up on. We don't totally know why. Like if we try to explain, we don't know, but it does show that this emergence of properties that are not reducible to their parts, it's contra materialism. If you were a materialist, you would have to say that like there's nothing interesting that can really emerge from
Hmm.
those things. But the research programs that try to operate this way didn't make a lot of progress. The people who focus on emergence and accepting that they can't reduce what emerges to something lower make a lot more progress. So it means that in practice, lots of people in AI research are becoming non-reductive naturalists at the very least, even if they don't explicitly acknowledge it.
Nice, man. So we got three arguments there from the top down: the hard problem, the rationality argument, and then AI emergence not reducible. What about the bottom up? You had one argument that I really enjoyed. I always remember reading Bishop Berkeley as an undergraduate, who was an idealist, and he just asked that question of like, what is matter? It's like everything can be reduced to matter, but he's like, but what is it? And like it starts this rabbit hole of like, yeah, hang on a second, is there really this bottom layer of just sand or something that's just like irreducible, or you know is there
Mhm.
other things going on?
Yeah, this really cracked in the early 20th century, both for practical, like empirical reasons, and also for philosophical reasons. But around the same years, so you can see first maybe the thing that people will think of like initially is what happened in fundamental physics in the quantum realm. So we have to be careful there because people want to go too fast, I think, often. But definitely, like what is widely agreed upon is that there are genuine probabilities going on at that level. So you cannot. It's really hard to say that, okay, really at the bottom layer of physics, what you find are stable particles that you can use to predict deterministically what's gonna happen in the future. There are
Mhm.
actually theorems that show, like Bell's inequalities, that show that like you don't really have hidden variables that we don't know that explain that really things are deterministic and materialistic at the bottom layer. You really do seem to have genuine probabilities at the bottom layer of physics. But that's a big problem for materialists, because materialists wanted to have stable particles at the bottom that they could then reduce everything to, and deterministically. That was the goal. Because if you need to talk about probabilities that will then, like, when a probability will be selected, it's going to inform what's lower. You're not really like following the materialist program. So materialists were really hoping for stable particles that you could deterministically reduce everything to. But that hasn't happened. There are people who try to defend these kinds of interpretations of quantum mechanics, but it's pretty hard. It's not really mainstream at all. Most people, even if they might disagree about how to interpret the probabilistic nature of what happens, they will agree that it's probabilistic. But that means that's a big problem for materialists. And the fact that there's disagreement too is a problem for the materialist. Like, ideally, if you want to reduce everything down to matter, you should be able to tell us what matter is, like at least a little bit. So this is a practical argument from physical science, but there's also a theoretical argument coming from philosophy. You can see Bertrand Russell making this argument. Maybe people made it before, I'm not aware, but it goes back at least to Russell, and it's pretty frequent now that people will invoke it in philosophy of mind, especially panpsychists like this kind of argument. It's that if you look at what physics actually tells us about physical entities, it never tells us their nature. It always only tells us about behavior. So take an example to make it clear. The electron is an entity that we only know extrinsically from physics. We know that it follows certain equations. Like, we say that it has a certain mass and a certain charge, let's say. But even what that really means is that if you put this value as the mass, this value as the charge in the equation, then you can predict a certain output. So even mass and charge are really like placeholders in equations. They're not like the nature of a thing. So physics will only ever give you the nature of things. Another objection that people might think of is that, well, maybe we'll discover one day that electrons are really made of particle X and particle Y, and that is going to be the nature of the electron. But that just obviously pushes the problem back down one layer. You can have the same problem for X and Y. Like, what is their nature? Do you just describe them with equations, or do they actually tell us what they are? So that means that physics, in principle, will only ever tell you the extrinsic nature of things, how they behave, and never what they really are. But that's a problem for a materialist, because if you wanted to reduce everything down to physics, let's say, you should tell us what physical entities are. Otherwise, you're just like, it's wishy-washy. We don't really know. So those are the arguments coming from the bottom.
Yes. Okay. Nice. So extrinsic, you mean in terms of like it only looks at behavior, like observable behavior of things, but that doesn't tell you what the thing actually is.
Yeah, like,
You'd
what's
have
the
to invoke
intrinsic
some
nature?
kind of like, yeah, and almost, yeah, a universal or a form or something to explain the kind of the nature of the thing. In some sense, like if a chair, if you just reduce it to the atoms of the chair, it doesn't tell you that it's a chair. Like, there is this structural, functional organization that's required. DC Schindler made that point to me. Like, you're talking about forms. As soon as you ask what is something, you're really asking the question of what is its form, like what is that, and because it relates to form and to its functionality. I mean, its final causality. So I guess maybe we're already sashaying here a little bit towards classical metaphysics. How would you describe the difference between classical metaphysics, which was supposedly displaced by reductive materialism and probably nominalism a bit? How would you describe the difference between them in a sense? If that's a sensible question.
Yeah, the way I like to introduce it is talking again from like the top and the bottom. That's why I like to introduce the errors of materialism from top down arguments and bottom up arguments, because those two extremes are what classical metaphysics uses as the start. So in classical metaphysics, you don't try to reduce everything down to the lower layer. You accept that all the layers exist. And there will be variations on this. So in Plato, for instance, you seem to give more value. People disagree about how to interpret Plato, but at least for a long time, like classical interpretations of Plato, people say that Plato mostly wants to say that the highest level is real. So God, the good itself, the beautiful itself, and so on is real. And then the world is sort of created top down from this until you get to matter. But there's this idea that you have different layers. And then in other thinkers, actually, like Plato might be saying this too, like depends on the scholarship, but it's very clear in Christianity, at least, that, okay, not only the top layer is real, but all the lower layers are real as well. And even in Christianity, matter itself as a kind of existence. Um, so the reasons why people made these kinds of moves in classical metaphysics, even before they knew about the issues that we talked about in modern science, were okay. In modern
Hmm.
science, we have an issue at the bottom. Like there seems to be probabilities there, and also we don't seem to be able to reduce minds, whether the human mind or even AIs we try to create. So even before I knew about those scientific kinds of arguments, there are abstract philosophical reasons why you would want to say that both forms and matter are real. So forms are abstract patterns. A very simple argument for the existence of forms is mathematical forms. But by the way, not all forms are mathematical. So, for instance, red is a form, but it's not like described mathematically. Like we have a phenomenal experience of that color, and it's a thing, even though it's not just math. But math, I think, is a good example because it's so obviously abstract. You can think of the Pythagorean theorem, for instance. This is a theorem that applies to time and space. It says that like this kind of triangle behaves this way, but it's not something that depends on the existence of space and time. Like it also doesn't depend on human minds. Like it was true before humans discovered it, and also the entire universe could stop existing and it would still be true. And this might not be obvious for people who haven't done a lot of math, but once you see the proof of a theorem, like the Pythagorean theorem, it becomes just obvious that okay, it had to be this way. Like there's no possible universe where things could have been
Hmm.
otherwise. Like maybe, like if you have, you can conceive of different geometries, so it's spherical geometries, and then the theorem is going to turn out a bit different, but still, like for this just a normal plane, the Pythagorean is just true. Like there's no way in which it could not have been true. So that means that the theorem is true outside of space and time. There could have been no time, no space, and the theorem would still have been true. So it means it's not material. But at the same time, you have to say that the theorem exists. If you're not gonna just deny that we have access to reality, you do have to say that the theorem exists, because if you don't accept that even something as obviously true as the Pythagorean theorem exists and gives you access to the world, then you're just like cutting yourself at the knees. You're never gonna get like knowledge about anything. People like there are people who try to be nonetheless about these kinds of things and deny that patterns exist. But much like we said earlier about the reduction of rationality not working out, you're gonna shoot yourself in the foot. Like if you try to deny the existence of patterns, like the Pythagorean theorem, but you can talk about all patterns. If you're gonna deny that, you're not gonna be standing on anything, because like your arguments have no place to stand on if you don't believe in patterns that you use to make your arguments.
Yeah, I mean, nominalism is a non-physical pattern. Like, it's not nominalism isn't a physical thing. It's an idea. Like, it's not. It
Yeah,
kind of undermines itself as well. And
yeah.
I thought, yeah, I want to double click on that, and that the Pythagorean theorem is true outside of time and space. Like that things are real that aren't within time and space, that are true, because in the materialist worldview, if it's all reducible to physics, it's all within time and space, and there's nothing outside of that. Whereas things like forms, even the form of, I mean, of a chair, like it doesn't exist in my mind or in your mind. It exists in some sense independently, and we can destroy an individual chair, and that form still exists. It's still there. Outside of time and space, the perfect circle, perfect triangle, you know, they all exist independently of particular instantiations of those. And actually, we understand the particular instantiations through the universals. I think that's Plato's kind of push of why the top bit is realer, because the top bit is the source of our intelligibility of the lower bit in the Platonic conception, which is something that's very much missing, I think, from our current ontology that helps to explain intelligibility. Um, but yeah, so you think that's the separation from classical metaphysics, is like the loss of forms, the loss of the top kind of half of that
And even the bottom
reality,
too, really, like a
and the
different
bottom reality.
understanding of the bottom too. Because
Yeah.
if you have forms, you don't have to be threatened by probabilities you find at the bottom. It's just
Hmm.
actually expected. So there's something you can see in Aristotle most clearly from antiquity.
Hmm.
Of course, if things change, that means that there's a substrate underneath them that is susceptible to change. And the lower you go into the hierarchy, the closer you're going to get to just pure potential.
Hmm.
So, like, example, so water can change from solid to liquid. That means that in the water, there's a possibility for both. But you can keep going lower and lower and lower. And it's not surprising from a classical standpoint that what you would find at the bottom layer of physics would be probability waves. And by the way, probability waves are not pure potential, because if we can give statistical distributions for how they behave, that means they have a certain pattern. They follow already a certain form. But classically, there's no problem in saying that even below that, there is pure potential that can be shaped into different probability distributions that we see from fundamental physics. And what that means is that in classical metaphysics, you have both extremes. You have forms, you have abstract patterns like the Pythagorean theorem, like red, like all of these forms exist outside of space and time. And you also have in space and time matter that is pure potential, formless, but susceptible of being shaped by forms. And then that means you can have all the layers of the hierarchy we talked about earlier without having to collapse them into just one. So you can have, okay, it's fine to have like fundamental particles. Even before that, it's fine to have probability waves above pure potential, and they can both exist. And it's fine to have also fundamental particles above your probability waves. They can they can exist, and like you can go layer by layer, and at each layer you have certain forms that come to structure a certain set of potential, and all the layers can exist. And now there are disagreements in the classical tradition about how like real how let's say the gradations of the real happen within that hierarchy. So arguably for most of the Platonic scholarship, you see that realness sort of decreases as you go down to matter. In Plato, it's maybe more equal, and then in Christianity, it's very clear that there is like realness at all of those layers. Whereas in materialistic reductionism, you would say that only the bottom layer is real, and everything else is just like a non-interesting illusion over the fundamental material layer.
And do you think Aristotle is slightly different? Because I know the interpretations of Plato that it's a very, I guess, yeah, that there's an unreality in matter, and then the reality comes from above, and it isn't. It's almost like an idealism. I don't agree with that interpretation myself. I think he does specify that each, like the good, is present in the cave in a sense, like it is, that there are levels of reality, but the levels are all real in a sense. I don't think they're entirely. Although I suppose the shadows and the echoes are less real than the light of the good and that. But do you think Aristotle is different in that? Is Aristotle more of an empiricist in a sense? That does he have? I don't, because I've been thinking about this like a conflict between Plato and Aristotle in some sense that emerges later, probably in Christian thought. But do you think he has a different version than Plato?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's also debated in the scholarship. So, like classically, people would tend to stress more the reality of matter in Aristotelian thought. So the lower layers would be real, and forms would only exist as their instantiations in matter.
Because he is the hylomorphism, like the forms don't exist independently of the material instantiation. It's like they're fused together, and if you took them apart, it wouldn't exist. Whereas for Plato, I don't think he thinks of it that way. Exactly.
Yeah, it seems, and it's been a while since I looked like closely enough at the scholarship to really be helpful here. But what I do remember clearly is that the kind of dualism I said earlier, the kind of contrast between Plato and Aristotle, used to be, I think, pretty common for quite a few centuries. But for the past few decades, there's been a wave of scholarship that tends to stress more the reality of all the layers in the hierarchy, both for Plato and Aristotle. Like the distinctions between Plato and Aristotle have been like put into question.
Yeah.
And even for later thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, like many people have been stressing more in the last few decades the Platonic dimensions of his thought, and the fact that like the way he uses Aristotle isn't like the caricature that people made it for a long time. So historically, I think there has been a view of duality between Plato and Aristotle, but it seems, at least in recent scholarship, that they're closer together. But regardless of that, even I would say in Christian Platonic thought, the reality of all the layers is pretty clear. Like in, I think in Dionysius, the Areopagite irons that out pretty quickly, like in the 4th or 5th century, where all the layers are real, because love allows all of the layers to be real. The forms give themselves down to the lower layers, and the matter emerges to support layers above and above and above, so that all of them are real in love, and there's no compromise. There's not as much the story of like difficult scholarship as we see in Plato and Aristotle. At least in Christian thought, it's pretty clear that all the layers are real.
Yes. Yeah, and it really what's coming up for me there is like the how that leads to a kind of anthropology of the human as between, matter and form, as the mediator of both, in some sense, the mediator of like meaning and matter. Whereas obviously for the materialist paradigm, the human is just reduced to matter. We're just this kind of like, I don't know, the dirt portion without the breath of God. But so in the classical world, we have this dual reality to us that isn't some people say of Plato that they're at odds with each other. Like that would be the Gnostic kind of interpretation of Plato. I think like that the soul or something is at odds with the matter and has to escape it. Whereas in Christian thought, as I understand, it's more like a hylomorphism, that the soul and the physical body are completely intertwined, and that as a result of the fall, there is this conflict between them. But you have that duality in reality in the person, which is a much richer anthropology, I think, than the reductive materialist account. Like, it's just so much more. Yeah, it can include a whole reality, transcendence, but yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, especially for humans. Maybe the thing to say too is that, well, in Christian thought, like for Aristotle, every physical thing is a union of matter and form.
Yeah.
So not just humans, but everything. Even the chair, like animals too, they have a form and they have matter that is informed by that form, and that's how the thing exists. What is special about humans is that we can connect. We are material like animals, but we also can connect to much higher forms, like forms that are as high as it gets. Really, like
Yeah.
you can contemplate God, you can contemplate abstract mathematics that are outside of space and time, which is not something that animals could do. So that means we can connect forms to matter that nothing else in creation can connect. Even
Yes.
angels in Christian thought, they can connect to abstract forms, but they don't have bodies, so they can't connect it. They can't connect forms to matter in the same way that we can. So there's something very special about humans indeed.
Yeah, and that's an important part of that kind of upper dimension in a sense, because that for Plato anyway, obviously it scales up to the form of the good. I generally interpret what he means the form of the good as God. Like it's the top
Yeah,
of
yeah.
that. The form of forms is God. And so the intercessioning levels as well are those disembodied beings in a sense that you can have a relationality with. That and I was interested in one of your interviews, you said something about powers and principalities, that you don't just avoid a power and principality, you replace it with a higher one in some sense. Like this was a big revelation for me being an atheist like before, because obviously as an atheist you kind of have to be a reductive materialist. Like you can't have this higher level of forms because what grounds the forms is God. And so you get, you're going to end up there. And it was almost like to avoid the pitfalls of the negative powers and principalities, you have to turn yourself over to the higher ones. Like you have to recognize reality in some sense, which is in the highest levels. And that was like a huge, I mean, for me, it was like seeing another, as if I'd been seeing half of the world for my whole life that suddenly appeared.
Yeah, there's I don't know if you read Charles Taylor, Secular Age. He talks about it a little
Yes.
bit
Yeah.
when our ancestors were all religious. It was unthinkable for them not to be religious because they saw the higher patterns that they participated in, and it was obvious that if you didn't have God to like house you, then
Safe.
yeah, then you would just be prey to other patterns. And like that can sound abstract, but it's pretty obvious. Like if you are wrestling with a certain sin, let's say we can take something obvious, like maybe alcoholism. You have a alcoholism problem. So this pattern of like going to get liquor and then it like destroying other aspects of your life, like driving all of your attention to the detriment of other things. Like this pattern towards alcohol is a higher pattern that you participate in. Like many people participate in this thing, and so it's not just you. Like it's a pattern in the world that has an impact on lots of people. And if you just try to get rid of your alcoholism, it's probably not going to work. Like people who just try, okay, I'm just going to stop. It almost never works. People typically have to like one stop that, but also like put themselves under another higher pattern. So maybe they go to AA, or maybe they join the church, or like they typically have to do
Mhm.
something. They might have to also like leave the attachments that remind them of alcoholism and their participation there. So they might have to leave some friends. They might have to stop
Mhm.
going to certain places that like put them back into that alcoholism pattern, and meet like other people, go to other places, join programs like AA that are gonna put them in a better pattern where they redirect like this time this potential that they
Yeah.
had that was put towards alcoholism, and they put that potential to another higher pattern. But this is true for all the sins we can participate in, all the ways in which we can be exploited by patterns. It can be something less obvious, like maybe the way that your attention is getting taken by X or by Facebook. Like if you want to not be prey to those in a bad way, then you need to make sure that you participate in another higher level pattern that is positive.
That's so interesting because I'm thinking of sins as like participation in lower pattern. It makes sense why sins are illusions in some sense because you're mistaking a lower pattern for a higher pattern. Like you're putting something in the place of God. It's like idolatry. Like you're putting a lower good in the place of where a higher good should be. And in some sense, you have to overcome that that pattern by seeing a higher one to replace it. Like you can't, and that's why you could get stuck at that level if you just simply refuse to participate in a higher form of existence. Dr. Anna Lemke said once to me that the solution to addiction is the reorientation of life. It's an entirely new life philosophy, and like religious conversion is the number one treatment for alcoholism. I mean, that's like empirically verifiable. So there's something really deep there, man, and that for me, because the powers and principalities thing, something it seems like for the Christian world or the ancient worldview was entirely based on like the existence of spirits, which are like forms that could potentially hijack you, like the porous self idea that Charles Taylor has. Like that was so like the even the idea of having a Holy Spirit, like versus other unholy spirits is like in a reductionist materialist world that doesn't have those forms. That's just like non-existent, and unsurprisingly, we've been possessed by totalitarian ideologies and horrendous like death cults, and we're like, oh yeah, I wonder why that happened, like because we completely ignored you know the things we built to protect us from that happening in the first place. Like you know it just for me on a personal level, that kind of realizing of powers and principalities is like demonstrable existence of the forms, or existence of non-physical physical things.
Yeah, that's an argument I don't talk about that much in the book, but for
Mm-hmm.
the ancients, yeah, as you said, it was obvious that like there are higher level patterns. You can also study them to some extent. So Plato in the Republic famously makes the analogy between a person and a city. So there are
Yes.
patterns in a city that mirror patterns in an individual person, and in the same way that the city has a certain head, a certain chief that's going to direct it, like the human body has a head that's going to direct the members and so on. You can study these things. Um,
Mhm.
the idea that you can, let's say, be part of a bad body or a good body was like pretty obvious for the ancients, and it's coming back. It's becoming clear to people, I think, because of things like social media too. Like the fact that our attention can be redirected to serve certain gods is becoming more and more common. People are becoming more comfortable talking
Yeah.
about angels and demons when they talk about modern technology.
And even IFS, I think, has been very big in that, like internal family system
Yeah, that's
therapy,
true.
in like seeing how you're a community of beings rather than just one, buffered self, essentially. And then, yeah, things that capture your attention. Because really, the cognitive science attention is just, it's like the end of it is just like attention functions by value. Like attention should be given to what's valuable, to what's relevant, to what's sacred. And then the question is like, well, what's relevant, what's sacred, what's valuable? And there's lower values and there's higher ones. Like, an addiction, alcoholism, these things capture your attention and hold it, but they're not actually. Once you start thinking attentionally, it's very hard to think any other way. That there aren't these competing forces for our attention. Some which are good for us, other ones which are very harmful. Like, but it seems like we're tiptoeing from classical metaphysics into Christianity now. Like in the book, you point out, you do say you could probably pump the brakes, like after reductive materialism, just be like, I'm just going to be a classical metaphysics guy. I'm not going to go go the whole hog of Christianity, which I thought was interesting because for me, I kind of, the more I got into classical metaphysics, the more I was just like, it's so unbelievably Christian. Like there's no kind of denying it at an extent, but you did seem to think it's possible to just be like, I'll just pause at classical metaphysics and like not go
Yeah,
into Christianity.
I think it's mainly because of my friendship with John Vervaeke, where
Oh yeah, true.
I think he lived as just a Platonist for decades.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
and he might be on the return back to Christianity now, but he spent so long as a Platonist that I acknowledge that this might be possible. Also, like on my own journey, like I was very happy just not to be a materialist for a while,
Yeah.
and I did make my way to Christianity, but also
Mhm.
like I can see, and I think it's worth acknowledging that this is already a great spot. And it depends on how you want to frame your apologetics. I think, like, if you look at my book, for instance, the way I argue in the classical metaphysics section, it's it's I would say pretty forceful. Like I don't really leave room for maybe this might be wrong. Like I'm very very confident that materialism is wrong and that classical metaphysics is correct. So I'm very
Mhm.
forceful there. But I think there's already enough people making like forceful, definitive arguments for Christianity. I don't feel like I need to do this, and typically they don't come from just metaphysics. Like I think I don't.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know if you know, but I think because Christianity like does at some point rest on revelation, I think it would be
Mm.
like I would tend to think it would be impossible to give like a philosophical argument alone that would be like definitive for Christianity. I think the way it works when you get to this layer rather is that Christianity, if you grant it um, a few claims, will then explain more things more elegantly than classical metaphysics can. But I think if you could give like an exhaustive philosophical argument for Christianity, you would be reducing Christianity to a philosophical
Mm.
system, which I don't think is possible. I think Christianity, because it's the highest, it cannot be reduced to anything
Yeah.
lower. So that's why, like, I don't.
I love that, man. Like, there's no knockdown argument for it in that sense. But I do think because something that really impacted me was how similar it was to Plato in a sense of like obviously way more advanced, but like you could see Plato like gesturing towards it, like his cave analogy and like the way that that ends in beholding the good, which is like an experience essentially. Like he has this kind of virtue epistemology where it's like you develop the character traits, you have the insights, you go on this journey, and then you have an encounter. Essentially, you get that kind of insight into insights, and you see that there's something that exists that's illuminating all of this machinery, and that so it works. And that experience in itself is like something that's super cathartic. I mean, the philosopher king is happier in their condemnation than the people that condemn them because they've had this experience. And like Plato obviously is thinking of Socrates in this case, and I think he really, for him, like Socrates is Jesus in a sense, but it's a very similar kind of thing of like the person, you know, the highest pattern of the person that could go to the good and return, and then that's what we're supposed to be emulating in some sense. Like that's what we, this is now moving to the kind of moral narrative level, but as a meta narrative I really saw how Plato was gesturing towards that, but like Christianity perfects it. Like Christianity takes it to like the next level. And that is completely necessary. Like there has to be a participatory, like how do we know the good and how do we know God? And you know, obviously for Christ, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but through me. Like he makes that possible for everyone, which Socrates I don't think does in the same way. But I think that for me would be where I'd see it's like there isn't another way. I don't that I'm aware of. I don't know. Is that landing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know you've spoken with DC Schindler on your podcast, and I suspect you've probably read this Plato book, Plato's Critique of
Totally.
Impure
Yeah.
Reason.
Couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah. So I I quite like that book because it does make the parallel between Christianity and Platonism like pretty striking in ways that I had not read before. I think there's a lot of new insights in that book, and one thing in particular that Schindler stresses that I think is worthwhile is the fact that like the good itself will be a kind of revelation to you if you do get close to it, and you
Mm,
cannot reduce it to something lower. But then what happens is when you do come into contact with the good, then when you come back down, you can sort of be a body for the good there.
mm,
Um, and that's how I see Christianity, like at a higher layer. I see like contact with the logos in Christianity, then enabling Christians to come down into the cave and do more than Platonists could. So I
mm,
do agree with you that I see this parallel. Um, what I would tend to say though is that this kind of interpretation of what happens in Plato, which I think is correct,
mhm.
gets to be more theological than just philosophical. So that's what I mean. Like Plato himself is not giving like knockdown philosophical arguments for
No, he kind of like
Platonism.
that they run out. He's just like you can't actually argue for it like at all.
Yeah,
Like he's like you have to go and do it. Like you
yeah.
can't. He could give you every argument in the world, but that won't like get you there.
I think what always happens in the Platonic dialogues is people try to reduce something higher to something lower, and Plato shoots them down. Like Socrates is always shooting them down. So there's no way to reduce what's highest to something lower. So you can say there's no way to reduce God to something lower. But like
Mm.
there's even no way to reduce Platonism to a set of arguments. And I think that's what Plato
Yeah,
is trying to do. So
totally.
um, he wants to get people into contact with the good. That's what he's trying to do. And there are many images for this, and Schindler does it very well in the book. And I don't remember it well enough to like
Mm,
say it better than you would. But I think what comes out is that you cannot give definitive philosophical arguments for Platonism, and that's only going to be more true for Christianity. I think you
mm,
have to um, make people attracted by the beauty. So that's what Plato often does with Socrates. So there are, people
mhm,
are trying to, let's say, reduce goodness to something else. Plato is shooting them. Socrates is shooting them down, but Socrates is embodying goodness in a way that like should put people into contact with goodness. So they do like so the dialogues do kind of answer the question in a way, like they do like in a way tell you what goodness is,
mm.
but they don't do it philosophically. They do it like through a story and through you being interactive.
Dramatically, like the
Yeah,
form of it becomes more, and yeah, like that Socrates, Schindler puts it that way, like that Socrates is like a symbol for the good in it, but in recognizing like his actual death and like the actual sacrifice that he makes, he becomes it almost like flips. I think he describes it as like a reversal in the narrative, where it's like it's not even about the narrative; it's almost like an image that flips to point at a reality to be like the image isn't the reality, so it's like you have to go. And like Plato's critique of images in like book 10 is like seems so weird because it's like he's just made this huge image and then he's complaining about images, but like the reason for doing that is because he's not making philosophical arguments, he's pointing towards something that are beyond the arguments and the images that you have to kind of use images to point to, but which the images are insufficient to actually capture in some sense.
yeah. So to go back to like what started this train of thought,
Yeah.
I think we can be very forceful in like denying materialism and
Mhm.
pointing towards classical metaphysics. I think we can be pretty forceful there. But when we reach this point, which is pretty high, if we try to get to something higher like Christianity, I don't think we can be as forceful because if we were, what would happen? I think is a kind of reduction that we want to avoid from what we
Mm.
saw in Plato. So that's why. So for instance, I can give you an example. There are a kind of argumentation that actually many people like is historical argumentation for why Jesus rose from the tomb. People will argue, let's say, based on the
Man,
fact that the apostles
it's
were martyrs.
so annoying. Like, I love Wes Huff, but like, he's got to stop, man. It's like totally, totally
But I think
mistakes all good.
but I think like this I think this can be like fine, but it's gonna sort of get you stuck at a certain layer, I think,
Mm,
if that's how you see Christianity. Because then what you risk doing is reducing Christianity to history. Um,
yeah.
so what I prefer to do is give an argument for Christianity that is like the structure we talked about for Plato. I try to give people an ideal. I try to give people like,
Mhm.
okay, if you granted Christianity, let's say you grant this, then here are all the beautiful things you can explain. So what I do in the book more specifically is I take a few aspects of creation. I draw the works of C.S. Lewis there. I take a few aspects of creation that are really hard to explain if you don't have Christianity. And I explain them in the light of the incarnation. Okay, then I can explain those things. I also take a problem from classical metaphysics. We talked about it earlier, the intrinsic nature of physical entities. Like, what
Mhm.
are really electrons? And this is not an answer. There's no answer to this really, like in the classical tradition or like in more recent post-reductionist thought. The only good answer I've seen comes from Christianity, like giving what is the real nature of things, really, like beyond
Yeah.
their equations. And I think Christianity can answer this. So I just give you an overview of the argument I want to make for Christianity.
Yeah.
We can talk more about the details, but I think it's good to point out the structure, given what you just said about Platonism and reducing um, Christianity or the good to something else. I think what the way I like to put it in the book rather, and again here I have John Vervaeke in mind because I don't think like forceful historical argumentation would have done any good trying to like point him towards Christianity. I think what is much more helpful is try to do what Plato did. Okay, I'm gonna try to point you towards that ideal, let's say Christianity, and then I'm gonna try to show you how if you grant these things and then you go back down into the cave, you can explain all of those things. You can put light on the shadows. So that's my strategy in the second half of the book.
Mhm. Yes. Okay. So yeah, that you can, if you apply this, it has more explanatory power in the lower levels than without it,
And that
and that
becomes
that
beautiful. That becomes attractive,
yeah.
and that it
Yes.
moves people towards Christianity in a way that is not like a forceful argument. It's a well,
Yeah.
it has
Yeah.
its own kind of force. It's kind of pull. I would say it's a yeah, like
Hmm.
beauty pulling people towards it.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And do you think? I mean, because you make the argument, something that we didn't touch on in the beginning that we really should have touched on. It was my own fault, but the zombification problem of reductive materialism, like, because really the what we're talking about here is that reductive materialism is the cause of the meaning crisis. It's the cause of this kind of decontextualization, depersonalization, this kind of existential horror show, that happens, and that it leads to us becoming like zombies, like mindless kind of consumption, pointless machines. And that the solution to that is in the resurrection. It's in the Christian story in some sense. Like, it's our participation in the sacrifice of Christ brings us back to life. Because you've set them up kind of as opposites in the book, if that makes sense. Like the reductive materialism has brought us down to the zombification, and now returning to Christianity can give us life again. Is that a fair kind of counterprise?
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, we can talk more about it. I opened the book with zombies because it is a good way, I think, to understand people, the impact outside of philosophy of something like reductionistic materialism. And also, I can already give a mythological idea of the solution in Christianity. So,
Mm-hmm.
zom-
Oh, I think you're muted there, JP.
oh yeah. So, sorry. Zombie myths are fairly recent. They arose in the like mid 20th century with I think Romero, Night of the Dead in like the 60s, and they've become more prominent. They peaked maybe around the mid 2010s, and they're sort of been they dipped down a little bit and then they've been stable, and it keeps coming back from time to time, like The Last of Us. Like there's always something that pops up because it's not a problem we've dealt with, but we use the zombie myth to talk about materialism as you mentioned, and for people who are not that familiar with symbolism, it might seem weird, but we do this with all kinds of stories. Like we don't spend billions of dollars each year on stories just to amuse ourselves. Like there are reasons why we care about those things and why we spend so much money on them. Even if you're a materialist, like you should understand that like evolution wouldn't select like this much waste. If we've been telling stories to each other since we could speak, like there are reasons for those stories, and typically is that these stories allow us to practice our perception of patterns that really exist in the real world. But it's a kind of play where you play with something similar and then it's going to transfer it to something in your real life. So, for instance, a classical example, every culture has stories of killing dragons. Um, Dragons are a good symbol for potential in general, both positive and negative. So dragons are a mix of predators that can kill us, like a cat that can, like, with its claws and its jaws that can eat us. It also has fire, like fire that can kill us, and even wings, because we used to be like small mammals that would be preyed upon by winged animals. So the dragon is a good representation of the negative sides of potential, but it also hoards gold. And typically, if you get the dragon, then you get the princess. So there's this idea that if you can dominate that danger, maybe you can tame the wild animal, maybe you can kill the lion that's terrorizing the tribe, whatever, then you will get all kinds of positive things after. So the story of, let's say, not waiting until the dragon comes to your village to destroy it, but rather going out to hunt down the dragon in his cave and then taming it or killing it, that's like a transferable story. It's applicable in the sense that Tolkien would say. If you explore this pattern narratively, then you're going to be able to better apply it in your own life when you're facing your own dragons. So we do this with stories in general. And the zombie arose in the 20th century because materialism, which did come out of a laboratory hypothesis from Galileo, leaked out, as you said earlier, and started to encroach upon more and more of reality. So at some point, people started to see themselves as just matter as well. If you explain more and more of the world in just reductionistic, materialistic terms, of course, at some point you're gonna forget God, because like it's just matter. Like there's no human mind, let alone any God. You're gonna forget that goodness and virtue are real. Like really, we're just monkeys that evolved to perpetuate our genes, and what we think is good is really just beneficial for this survival of the species. So you evacuate goodness, and at some point you think, well, we've explained so many things with physics, really, that I can't explain the mind yet, but really the mind is just physics. Like somehow we'll discover it. But that kind of thing puts you in a meaning crisis. That, like, if you know those ideas, they're gonna have a meaning crisis. And even if you don't like explicitly study philosophy and you don't talk about those kinds of things, it's still gonna trickle down into the culture. Like the intellectuals, the elite, they're gonna care more about material things than about spiritual things. So our elites are no longer, let's see, priests or religious people or people who do tons of good works. Our elites are like CEOs of big companies, or now it's like influencers, or like it's people who focus on material gains. And by the way, I don't want to speak bad about CEOs. I think like running a company can be perfectly good thing to do. Even like social media can be used well. But the point I'm trying to make is that like we've shifted what we consider to be the elite occupation, and also what we consider to be the best like thing to make you happy. We've started to think that the billionaire is happier than the monk, which would have been obviously false to people in earlier ages, and I think it's starting to be more obvious now as well. But what that means is there's a relationship between like cultural materialism, where you care only about material gain, and philosophical materialism, where you consider that only matter is real. And the zombie is a good representation for those things, because the zombie only cares about eating stuff. He's only like the material aspects of ourselves, we can say. He wants to eat others, not celebrate with them. He doesn't have friends. Like zombies walk together, but they don't have any kind of communion. They don't even talk to each other. They just run. They have no meaning, no real spirit. They are homeless, so they can't really build anything. They just go from place to place. We feel like this is happening to us. We only care about our careers, let's say, and then we'll just move and we won't build communities that actually nourish us. And it's very interesting that the zombie eats brains. It's the only creature that specifically does this. There are other creatures that represent materialism, by the way. Like robots also do this a little. Like, are we just robots? And there's tons of stories that explore this. And it's tied with reductionism, obviously. But zombies are even more special because zombies eat brains. And if you're a materialist, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to reduce the mind to something material like the brain. So you can see that zombies are like the materialist spreading outside of the lab and contaminating more and more of the world. There are more parallels we could say, but maybe the one I can use to finish is that in the zombie story, typically there's no positive way out. Like there's no hope. If you're a materialistic reductionist, you are also a nihilist, where you think there's no real good and there's no reason why things would end well in the end. We we will not stop the march of materialistic nihilism. Zombies are just going to keep spreading, and at best, people in classical zombie movies would just try to survive for as long as they can, but they would know that ultimately they would perish.
So funny, man. I'm an absolute zombie film fanatic. Like, I think I've watched every single zombie thing that's ever come out. And there's a real thing of like The Walking Dead, like season 11. It's just like they're just still wandering around. Like, nobody has any, like, they're like, how do we solve this? I was like, I don't know. The army will come in and kill everybody or something. Like, there's never a good solution. Like, there's like a vaccine maybe or something, like, but never a good, because none of them would think the solution is the Eucharist. Like, nobody's going to be like, we need to give these zombies, the flesh of Christ. It just, our culture just doesn't, couldn't go there. So
Well,
maybe,
the
yeah.
closest is Warm Bodies. Like, have you read the
I've
book Warm Bodies? Seen the
No, I
movie?
haven't read the book. Yeah, I saw the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's similar in the book. It's maybe a little bit more obvious in the book. There are more like Christian
Mhm.
parallels in the book, maybe, but still, like in the movie, you can still see that it's like gesturing towards the solution, because
Yeah.
zombies come back to life not because of a vaccine or something, but they come back to life because they like give themselves to others, because they love others and they give themselves for others, and that's how they progressively become humans. So I think that's gesturing at least towards a solution.
Nice. Yeah, it's like a relational, stop eating people's brains and get involved in communities kind of is the cure.
Yeah, and I think like it's become it's more obvious in Christianity.
Mhm.
But so I mean we can talk more about that. In even before we talk about the solution, it's worth pointing out that there's this inversion in the zombie story of the Christian story. So zombies can be seen as a way. They're really the sign of a culture that has lost its Christianity. And we can even go back to the metaphysics we talked about earlier. Like if you go back to most ancient classical systems, it was obvious that forms are real and that there is goodness there, and that reductionism made no sense. Christianity, by affirming that all the layers are real, gave value to the material world in a way that you don't see ancient intellectual systems do. You don't see that in the East. You don't see that in the ancient Greeks. So that did open up the door for down the line something like Galileo saying that the external world is mathematizable and that it's real. And it did open the door to us at some point thinking that there's only matter and that the mind doesn't really exist. So like the fact that the zombie arises in a Christian culture is not an accident. It's the fact that like materialism comes out of Christian culture.
Yeah.
And also, it's worth pointing out that there were materialists in ancient Greece, and people tried to reduce things before, but like you also needed math. You also needed to respect forms, at least enough to try math. And you need to have a society that had enough order and enough wealth to have people doing full-time science to advance those kinds of things. So I think really like you needed both to give value to the physical world and to give value to forms to be able to do something like science and develop materialism. So I think it had to happen in Christianity pretty much.
Probably Christian compassion as well, because in ancient Greece they just killed them a lot of the time. I'm thinking of what was that guy, Anaxagoras?
These annoying philosophers.
Trials and kind of didn't really let him away with it, to be honest. So yeah, Christians being nice guys, they didn't torture Galileo enough. You should have got.
Yeah, that's a good point.
they let him out.
But we can even dig deeper, because mythologically in the zombie you'll see all kinds of versions of Christianity. You can see it as an inversion of mass. So zombies will, rather than sing together, they will just groan. Rather than being in communion with each other and like exchanging the sign of peace and so on, they like don't care at all about each other. And if there are humans otherwise, like they just want to eat them. They're not thankful for anything. Zombies just want to devour. Also, zombies are undead. Like they are a parody of the resurrection, where they do come back to eternal life in a way, but it's an eternal life without quality. It's just material. There are probably other parallels I'm forgetting, but this all makes, I think, a pretty strong point that zombies are a symbol that we're using as a culture to understand our materialistic nihilism. And the solution you can also find in Christianity. So that's like I'd say, a mythological way of saying what I do in the book in general. Like I try to give a Christian remedy to the meaning crisis in the book, but you can see it in the myth of the zombie too, because and how it's solved in the mass. I would say the zombie eats people. The zombie eats brains. So the zombie would, of course, like want to eat Jesus. Would want to eat the Eucharist, but the Eucharist will operate a huge flip on the zombie because okay, like Jesus accepts to be eaten by zombies. He accepts to be killed by us. But what
Mhm.
happened when Jesus was killed by us, when we ate him, we can say, is that he brought us into his story. So we did, in a way, like eat his flesh, but he also ate us and put us into his body by doing that. Um, and there's all kinds of levels at which we can talk about this. Very practically, we can emphasize the fact that when we participate in liturgy, when we participate in the Eucharist, we're practicing exactly the skills we need to stop being a zombie. So if you practice seeing God in the Eucharist, like it's going to be hard to stay materialist. Like look at the molecules there; it's
That's
bread molecules. So if you like
100%.
so if you see a connection between that like material level of bread and God behind form and matter, then you are chipping away at your tendency to materialize things. If you if you see that does give himself to others and calls us to do the same, then you don't want to like devour or exploit your brothers and sisters. You want to do good for them. You want to sing with them rather than just like ignore them or devour them. Um,
Mhm.
you want to build a community rather than just roam around and change whatever you're doing. So the liturgy makes you focus on exactly the right things, and the sacrifice of Jesus in the Eucharist is like the kind of thing that the zombie is just naturally pulled towards. So I find that really fascinating because it's like you have in the myth of the zombie a caricature of what happens in the liturgy, but you still open the door to the solution.
Mhm. I mean, man, it's so incredible. Like, I would have bet $1 million that the Eucharist couldn't be the solution to the meaning crisis. Like, I would have thought that that was impossible. And yet, like, think about everything that we've just talked about, like this loss of the form, the loss of the pattern, the falling to the material. Thinking of the Eucharist as just bread is the most materialist thing you can possibly do. Even thinking of it as a symbol is materialist, because if you recognize that the form is what informs the matter, that literally the meaning makes it what it is, then in that moment when the priest says those words, it is the body of Christ. And that is like, you're, in a sense, you're accepting the reality beyond materialism in an act of ritual. Like, and that's the covenant that Christ offers to us in, like, to participate in his, I mean, what would you call it? I don't know, life, eternal life beyond this material zombification that happens when we just live in the material. I mean, like, who could have predicted that? Like, I never, you know what I mean?
I
Like,
do remember hearing, I think it's the theologian Brett Sokold. He wrote a good book
yeah,
on transubstantiation, and he spoke with Paul Vernicke a few times.
Brett
And
Sacco. Like, yeah.
I heard him make a good point that because he did his PhD on the Eucharist, and that's
Mm,
like the book that he published with the title Transubstantiation. And he
yeah.
said that like it was very interesting for him to focus on the Eucharist because through the centuries, the Eucharist did operate as a kind of shield against the errors of the modern world. Because if
Mm,
like some while like there's this zombification happening in society with materialism ramping, ramming through society and people becoming nihilists. Like if someone could hold on to the Eucharist, then they would be like preserved really from this materialism going through culture. So it's not I'm not the first person making this kind of point, but it's fascinating that like concretely the way it works out in the zombie story like is so neat. I don't think that's something that people would have said, I don't know, 2 centuries ago. Like the zombie myth itself is fairly recent, but
yeah. Mm.
the idea that the Eucharist is a kind of shield, that's an old idea.
Yes, and I've heard it say, I think it was Max Weber made the argument that, like, the Protestant work ethic was a kind of substitute for for the mystery of transubstantiation, like our kind of worldliness, our like need to achieve in this world, and just like to work to feel, you know, I don't know what you would say, like worthy of it or something, was a replacement for the actual participation, transubstantiation. And even that, like not taking the Eucharist in mortal sin and needing to confess and needing to be concerned with the quality of your soul, is like, it really lends credence to that shield argument that you're making of like, if you could just do that and do it well, you'd be all right. Like that would be like, you know, you won't fall into these other pitfalls. Like,
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's interesting. I had not heard that from Weber.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll need to think more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think we've pretty much covered everything, man. That's all the way from like reductive materialism through classical metaphysics to Christianity, to the Eucharist saving us from the zombie apocalypse. Pretty
Perfect.
good place to finish up, I think. So thank you
Perfect.
so much, JP.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, and I encourage people. I'm going to put the link in the bio. This book is the best introduction to these issues possible. Like I haven't read another book that covers them all with such clarity. So I think it's perfect for people. I'm going to be
Thank you.
giving it to people for Christmas and harassing them with it. So I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Thank you.